They say every man has his price. Mine was $5, the same as a pair of boots, a month's worth of candles, or a decent bottle of rum. I was 11 years old when I learned that lesson on the Philadelphia docks. By the time I was 30, I'd made certain that everyone who'd profited from my suffering paid a price far higher than they could afford. This is the story of how a boy worth $5 became the man who brought empires to their knees. The morning fog clung to the Philadelphia docks like a shroud when young Thomas Webb learned the exact measure of his worth. $5, the same price as a decent pair of boots or a month's supply of candles. He was 11 years old, though he looked younger, malnourished and small for his age, with dark hair that hung in greasy tangles around a dirt-smudged face. His clothes were little more than rags, held together by crime and desperation. He'd been sleeping in doorways and alleys since his mother died of fever 6 months prior, scrounging for scraps, dodging the night watch, and trying to survive in a city that had no use for orphaned boys. The man who bought him was named Silas Blackwood, a merchant of considerable wealth and even greater cruelty. He stood on the dock that grey October morning, his powdered wig pristine despite the damp air, his velvet coat the colour of dried blood. His eyes, small and calculating, assessed Thomas the way one might examine a horse at market, checking teeth, feeling for muscle, looking for signs of disease. $5, Blackwood said to the dockmaster who'd caught Thomas stealing bread. Not a penny more. Look at him. He's half dead already. The dockmaster, a brutish man named Harrow, shrugged. $5 or the workhouse? Your choice, boy. Thomas wanted to spit in both their faces. He wanted to run, but he'd tried running before, and the streets of Philadelphia in 1755 were no kinder than the men who prowled them. Winter was coming, and with it, the certainty of death for a homeless child. At least as an indentured servant, he'd have food, shelter, a chance to survive. He didn't know then that survival would come at a price far higher than $5. I'll take him, Blackwood said, producing a small leather purse from his coat. He counted out 5 Spanish dollars, each coin hitting the dockmaster's palm with a soft clink that sounded to Thomas like a cell door closing. Papers were signed. Thomas's thumbprint was pressed into wax, binding him to 7 years of servitude, until he turned 18 and could claim his freedom. 7 years seemed like an eternity. Blackwood's carriage waited at the end of the dock, black lacquered wood gleaming even in the weak morning light. The merchant gestured impatiently. Get in, and don't touch anything with those filthy hands. Thomas climbed into the carriage, his first time ever inside such a conveyance. The seats were upholstered in burgundy velvet, soft as anything he'd ever felt. He sat as still as possible, aware of how his presence sullied the elegant interior. As the carriage rolled through Philadelphia's cobblestone streets, Blackwood studied him with those cold, calculating eyes. You'll work in my household, kitchen duties, cleaning, whatever my housekeeper requires. You'll sleep in the cellar. You'll eat what you're given and be grateful for it. You'll speak only when spoken to. Disobedience will be punished severely. He paused, letting the words sink in. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Thomas whispered. Louder. Yes, sir, Thomas said, his voice cracking. Blackwood smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Good. You'll address me as Master Blackwood, my wife as Mistress Blackwood. You are now property of this household, bought and paid for. Remember that. The Blackwood estate sat on the outskirts of the city, a grand 3-story mansion of brick and white columns that spoke of old money and older cruelties. Thomas was taken around to the servants' entrance, where a severe-looking woman in a grey dress awaited them. "This is Mrs. Hutchins, the housekeeper," Blackwood said. "She'll see to your training. Disappoint her, and you'll answer to me." Mrs. Hutchins looked Thomas up and down with barely concealed disgust. "We'll burn those rags and scrub him down. He's bringing lice into a decent household." What followed was the most humiliating hour of Thomas's young life. He was stripped naked in the servants' washroom, his clothes thrown into the fire. Mrs. Hutchins and 2 serving girls scrubbed him with lye soap and stiff brushes until his skin was raw and bleeding in places. They cut his hair down to the scalp, checking for lice and finding plenty. The girls giggled at his nakedness, his vulnerability, while Mrs. Hutchins worked with grim efficiency. When it was done, he was given a rough cotton shirt and breeches, servant's clothes, but cleaner than anything he'd worn in months. His feet remained bare. "Servants don't wear shoes," Mrs. Hutchins informed him. She led him through the house, pointing out his duties. The kitchen needed constant attention, water hauled from the well, firewood brought in, pots scrubbed, floors swept. The chamber pots needed emptying every morning. The dining room required setting before each meal. The front steps must be swept daily. The list went on and on. "You'll wake at 4, she said. "Breakfast for the servants is at 5, after the fires are lit. The family breakfasts at 8. Your day ends when the last dish is cleaned and the fires are banked for the night, usually around 10. 18 hours of labor." Thomas's stomach sank. "One more thing," Mrs. Hutchins said, her voice dropping. "Stay away from Master Blackwood's study on the 3rd floor. That door is always locked, and it's to remain so. Whatever you hear from that room, you forget immediately. Understood?" Thomas nodded, though he didn't understand at all. The cellar where he would sleep was dank and cold, with moisture seeping through the stone walls. His bed was a straw pallet on the floor, a single threadbare blanket his only comfort. Rats skittered in the shadows, but Thomas had slept in worse places. At least the rats weren't the 2-legged kind. He thought he'd be able to endure it. 7 years. He could survive 7 years of anything. He was wrong. The first 6 months in the Blackwood household were hard but bearable. Thomas worked from before dawn until long after dark, his hands becoming calloused and scarred from constant labor. The food was plain but plentiful, more than he'd eaten on the streets. His body began to fill out, muscles developing from the endless hauling and scrubbing. Master Blackwood largely ignored him, which Thomas considered a blessing. Mistress Blackwood, a pale woman with nervous hands and frightened eyes, never met his gaze. It was as if he were invisible to them, just another tool in their household. But tools can break, and when they do, they're discarded. It started on a cold March evening. Thomas was in the kitchen cleaning the dinner dishes when he heard raised voices from upstairs. Master Blackwood's voice, angry and slurred from drink. Mistress Blackwood's voice, pleading. Then a crash, the sound of breaking glass. Mrs. Hutchins, standing beside Thomas at the wash basin, went rigid. "Don't react," she whispered. "Don't acknowledge it. Just keep working." Thomas kept scrubbing, but his hands trembled. He'd heard plenty of violence in the Philadelphia streets, but something about the sounds from upstairs made his stomach clench with dread. A door slammed. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Master Blackwood burst into the kitchen, his face flushed with rage and wine, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "You," he said, pointing an unsteady finger. "Come with me." Mrs. Hutchins stepped forward. "Sir, the boy has work to—" "Silence," Blackwood roared. "I own him, and I'll do with him as I please. Boy, come now, or I'll drag you." Thomas dried his hands on his apron and followed, his heart hammering. They climbed the stairs to the third floor, to the forbidden study. Blackwood produced a key from his waistcoat and unlocked the door. The study was unlike anything Thomas had seen. The walls were lined with dark wood shelves holding leather-bound books and strange instruments. Glass vessels, metal devices, collections of what looked like bones. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, covered in papers filled with cramped handwriting. And on the walls hung paintings, but not ordinary portraits. These showed scenes of suffering, bodies twisted in agony, faces contorted in terror. "Do you know what I collect, boy?" Blackwood asked, his voice suddenly calm. He walked to his desk and poured himself another brandy from a crystal decanter. "No, sir," Thomas whispered. "Information, knowledge, specifically knowledge about the human capacity for suffering." He smiled. That same cold smile from the day he'd bought Thomas. "I'm a man of science, you see. I study pain, its limits, its applications. The British Crown pays me handsomely for this research. Information is valuable in times of war, and we are always at war with someone." Thomas's blood turned to ice. "You're wondering why I'm telling you this," Blackwood continued, circling around Thomas like a predator. "It's because you're going to help with my research. You see, I need subjects, street urchins who won't be missed, servants who are bound by law to obey me. You fit both categories perfectly." "Please," Thomas managed. "Please, sir, I'll work harder. This is your work now." Blackwood grabbed Thomas by the collar and dragged him to a door at the back of the study. This opened onto a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Your real purpose, the reason I buy children for $5 instead of proper servants." What Thomas saw in the basement beneath the study would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a chamber of horrors. Stone walls sweating with moisture, chains hanging from the ceiling, a wooden table with leather straps and dark stains, instruments of pain arranged with surgical precision on a metal tray, and in the corner, a huddled figure. Another child, a girl perhaps 9 years old, her eyes empty and broken. Thomas screamed, he fought, he clawed at Blackwood's hands, kicked at his shins, but the man was much stronger, and fueled by drink and darker impulses. Blackwood struck him across the face, splitting his lip. Then again harder. Thomas's vision swam with stars and blood. "You'll learn," Blackwood said, breathing heavily. "They all learn. Resistance only makes it worse." Over the following months, Thomas learned exactly what Blackwood meant. The merchant's research was nothing more than sadism dressed in the language of science. He subjected Thomas to various torments, beatings, burnings, near drownings, always carefully, always methodically, taking notes in his leather journal about how long Thomas screamed when he begged, at what point he lost consciousness. Between sessions, Thomas was returned to his normal duties, expected to work as if nothing had happened. The other servants knew. How could they not? But they said nothing, did nothing. Mrs. Hutchins would sometimes leave extra food for him, her eyes full of pity but empty of courage. The serving girls avoided him entirely, afraid that helping him might make them the next subjects. The girl in the corner of the torture chamber died after 2 weeks. Blackwood disposed of her body like refuse, and Thomas never learned her name. She was replaced by another child, a boy this time, purchased for $7 from a debtor's prison. He lasted a month. Thomas survived because he learned to endure. He taught himself to retreat deep inside his mind during Blackwood sessions, to build walls around the part of himself that could feel pain. He became two people, the broken body that Blackwood tormented, and the hidden self that watched from a distance, memorizing every detail, nurturing a cold flame of hatred that grew brighter with each wound. One night, after a particularly brutal session that left him bleeding and barely conscious on the cellar floor, Thomas made himself a promise. He would survive. He would learn everything he could about Blackwood, his habits, his secrets, his weaknesses. And when he was free, when those 7 years finally ended, he would destroy the man who'd bought him for $5. 7 years became his mantra. 7 years until freedom. 7 years until revenge. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The fire started on a night in late autumn, nearly 2 years after Thomas had entered the Blackwood household. He was 13 now, taller and stronger despite the abuse, his body hardened by labor and suffering. The hidden self inside him had grown sharp and cold, calculating every detail of the house and its master's routines. Thomas was in the kitchen that evening, banking the fires for the night, when he smelled smoke. Not the familiar wood smoke from the hearth, but something different, acrid and urgent. He rushed to the hallway and saw flames licking up the main staircase, spreading with terrifying speed. "Fire!" he shouted. "Fire!" The household erupted in chaos. Servants ran in all directions. Mrs. Hutchins was trying to organize a bucket brigade. Through the smoke, Thomas could see Mistress Blackwood on the second-floor landing, screaming hysterically. And Master Blackwood was nowhere to be seen. Thomas knew where he was, in the study, in his precious torture chamber, probably with another victim, probably too drunk to notice the smoke. The rational part of Thomas's mind told him to run, let the house burn, let Blackwood burn with it. It would be justice, wouldn't it? Divine retribution for his crimes. But there was another child down there. Thomas had seen Blackwood bring a new boy into the house just that morning. Couldn't have been more than 8 years old, wide-eyed and terrified. Thomas made his decision in an instant. He grabbed a wet cloth from the kitchen, held it over his mouth, and ran up the main stairs through the thickening smoke. The heat was intense, singeing his eyebrows and hair. The second floor was already engulfed, flames roaring through the hallways like living things. He reached the third floor, coughing violently, his eyes streaming tears. The study door was closed, but unlocked. Thomas burst through and immediately saw Blackwood collapsed across his desk, overcome by smoke. Papers everywhere were beginning to smolder. Thomas didn't hesitate. He ran to the back door and down the narrow staircase into the torture chamber. The young boy was chained to the wall, unconscious but breathing. Thomas searched frantically for the key, finally finding it in Blackwood's desk drawer. His hands shook as he unlocked the shackles. The boy was small, enough that Thomas could carry him. He hoisted the child over his shoulder and turned to leave, then stopped. Blackwood's journal sat on the desk, thick leather binding embossed with gold. All his research, all his crimes, documented in meticulous detail, evidence of every child he'd tortured, every death he'd caused. Thomas grabbed it, shoving it into his shirt. Then he ran. Getting out was harder than getting in. The third-floor landing was completely engulfed now. The main staircase was impassable. Thomas remembered a servant's stair at the back of the house, narrow and old, but it might still be clear. With the unconscious boy heavy on his shoulder and his lungs screaming for clean air, he ran through the smoke-filled hallways. The servant's stair was intact, though smoke poured up from below. Thomas descended blindly, one hand on the wall, counting steps, praying he wouldn't pass out before reaching the bottom. 20 steps. 30. His legs threatened to give out. 40. He burst out the back door into the blessed cold night air and collapsed on the grass, still clutching the child. They both gasped and coughed, sucking in great lungfuls of clean air while the house burned behind them. People were gathering, neighbors, the night watch, servants who'd escaped. But Thomas only cared about the small boy breathing shallowly beside him, alive despite everything. "Did you see Master Blackwood?" Mrs. Hutchins appeared beside him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Is he—" "He was unconscious in the study," Thomas managed between coughs. "I couldn't carry them both." It was the truth, if not the whole truth. He could have tried to drag Blackwood out, could have called for help instead of taking the journal, could have done many things. He chose not to. By morning, the Blackwood mansion was a smoking ruin. They found the master's body in what remained of his study, burned beyond recognition. Mistress Blackwood had escaped, but was in shock, unable to speak coherently. 3 servants had died in the fire, trapped in their third-floor rooms. The boy Thomas had saved was taken in by a local church. He would survive, physically if not emotionally, and Thomas had to content himself with that small victory. An investigation determined the fire had started in the kitchen, a coal that had rolled from the hearth, or so the fire marshal concluded. Thomas said nothing to contradict this. He'd been banking the fires after all. It could have been his fault, an accident, but late that night, alone in the ruins of the servants' quarters, Thomas remembered something. A candle on the main staircase that hadn't been there before. A candle that no one had mentioned. A candle that Thomas hadn't placed there, but that someone might have if they wanted to create a distraction while they set another fire elsewhere. Thomas remembered Mrs. Hutchins's face when he'd first arrived, when she'd warned him about the study. The pity in her eyes every time Blackwood took him upstairs. The extra food she'd leave, as if kindness could compensate for cowardice. He remembered other servants who'd worked in the house before him. Where had they gone? How many had there been? Thomas realized he might not have been the only one who wanted Silas Blackwood dead. But it didn't matter now. The monster was gone, and Thomas was free. His indenture burned up along with the papers that bound him. He had Blackwood's journal hidden under his shirt. He had his life. He had his freedom 2 years earlier than expected. And he had a new understanding. The world was full of monsters like Blackwood. Men who bought children for pocket change and used them until they broke. Men who hid their cruelties behind wealth and respectability. Thomas was 13 years old, homeless again, but no longer the frightened boy who'd been sold on the docks. The fire had burned away that boy. What remained was something harder, something dangerous, something patient. Thomas spent the next year on the streets, but this time he wasn't merely surviving. He was learning. Blackwood's journal had taught him valuable lessons, though not the ones the merchant intended. It contained names, dozens of them, wealthy men who'd commissioned Blackwood's research, government officials who'd paid for information about pain thresholds and breaking points, a network of cruelty that stretched far beyond one sadistic merchant. And next to each name, amounts, money changing hands, enough money to make a clever boy very wealthy if he knew how to use the information properly. Thomas kept the journal hidden, wrapped in oilcloth and buried in a secret spot only he knew. But he memorized every page, every name, every detail. He learned to read better by studying it, sounding out words he didn't know, working out meanings from context. He also learned something else. The world of the wealthy had patterns, routines, weaknesses. During the day, Thomas worked odd jobs, running messages, sweeping shops, hauling cargo. He was careful never to stay in one place too long or draw too much attention. But he watched. He listened. He learned how the gears of Philadelphia society turned, who held power and who served it, who could be bought and who could be blackmailed. At night, he educated himself differently. He broke into houses, not to steal at first, but to learn. He practiced moving silently, picking simple locks with bent nails, memorizing layouts. He was small enough to slip through windows, quick enough to vanish into shadows. One night, he broke into a lawyer's office and spent hours reading case files by candlelight, teaching himself the language of contracts and laws. Another night, he entered a doctor's study and pored over medical texts, understanding how the body worked, where it was strong and where it was vulnerable. He stole sometimes. Small amounts, never enough to attract attention. A few coins here, some food there, occasionally, clothes that fit him better. He was building resources, planning for a future he could barely imagine but refused to abandon. By age 14, Thomas had transformed himself. No longer the starving, frightened boy sold for $5. He'd become something more dangerous, a ghost who moved through Philadelphia's underbelly with purpose and precision. He'd grown taller, filled out, and learned to carry himself with confidence. He could affect different accents, play different roles, a servant boy, a street tough, a merchant's son when properly dressed. And he was planning. The first name in Blackwood's journal belonged to a man named Edmund Carver, a magistrate who'd paid Blackwood £200 for information about interrogation techniques. Carver lived in a fine townhouse near the center of the city, respected by all, feared by criminals who appeared before his bench. Thomas spent 2 months watching Carver's household. He learned the magistrate's schedule, his habits, his vices. He learned that Carver had a gambling problem and substantial debts. He learned about a mistress hidden away in a house on the river. He learned that Carver's eldest son was simple-minded, kept locked away to avoid embarrassing the family. Then one night, Thomas arranged a meeting. He dressed in his best stolen clothes and approached Carver outside the magistrate's favorite tavern. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I have information about Silas Blackwood that might interest you. Information about certain payments he recorded in his journal before he died." Carver's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about, boy. The journal survived the fire, Thomas said quietly. I have it, and I know what you paid him for, how you used that information in your court, how many men you sent to the gallows based on confessions extracted using Blackwood's methods. You're lying, but Carver's voice shook. £200, paid in 4 installments between March and September of 1754. You consulted with him personally about the trial of the Kensington conspiracy. 3 of those men died screaming, didn't they, based on confessions obtained through torture. Thomas let that hang in the air, watching Carver's face cycle through fear, rage, and calculation. What do you want? Carver finally asked. Nothing yet, Thomas said, but I'll be in touch. Meanwhile, I'd suggest paying your gambling debts and being kinder to your son. Otherwise, I might share that information about your mistress with your wife, or the journal entries with the Gazette. Imagine how the public would react to learning their magistrate is a torturer. He walked away, leaving Carver trembling in the street. Thomas did this 12 more times over the next 2 years. Each man from Blackwood's journal received a visit, a careful revelation of what Thomas knew, a subtle threat that was never quite explicit enough to be actionable. He never asked for money directly. That would be extortion, a hanging offense. Instead, he positioned himself as someone these men would want to keep happy. By his 16th birthday, Thomas Webb had transformed himself from victim to puppet master. He'd never spent a penny of the money that began appearing in dead drops and coded messages, payment for his silence. He saved every coin, investing it carefully through intermediaries, building a foundation. He took a new name, Thomas Blackwell, a reminder of who he'd been and what had been done to him. He bought proper clothes, rented a room, enrolled himself in evening classes to improve his reading and writing. He learned French from a tutor, numbers from an accountant's clerk he'd befriended. He studied law, medicine, commerce, everything he'd need to move in the world he planned to enter. And every night, he remembered the dock, the $5, the cellar floor, the torture chamber, the smell of his own burned flesh, every child who died in that basement, every moment of pain that Blackwood had inflicted. The merchant was dead, but his legacy lived on in the men who'd funded him, the system that had protected him, the world that allowed children to be bought and sold like cattle. Thomas's revenge wouldn't be quick or simple or focused on one man. It would be vast and patient and thorough. He would tear down the entire structure that had made his suffering possible. He would become powerful enough that no one could ever make him powerless again. The boy sold for $5 would rise, and when he reached the heights, he would remember everyone who'd stepped on him on the way down. By 1762, at age 18, Thomas Blackwell had become someone of note in Philadelphia. Not wealthy yet, not powerful, but known. He worked as a clerk in a trading house, trusted with important correspondence and sensitive information. His employers praised his discretion, his intelligence, his remarkable memory for details. They didn't know about the other Thomas, the one who moved through the city's shadows with equal ease, the one who collected secrets like other men collected coins. The American colonies were changing. Tensions with Britain grew stronger each year. The French and Indian War had ended, but the peace was uneasy. New taxes were imposed. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and colonial resentment simmered toward boiling. Men gathered in taverns and meeting halls to discuss independence, liberty, rights. Thomas listened to all of it. He insinuated himself into conversations, offered insights, made himself useful. He had information after all. He knew which merchants smuggled goods to avoid taxes. He knew which officials took bribes. He knew secrets that men would kill to protect. He used this knowledge carefully, strategically. He helped a struggling merchant avoid financial ruin by revealing that his partner was embezzling. The merchant became a valuable ally. He warned a printer about an impending raid by royal officials. The printer's press began publishing pamphlets favorable to Thomas's interests. He exposed a corrupt tax collector. The man's replacement owed Thomas his position. Slowly, methodically, Thomas built a network. Not of friends, he had no friends, trusted no one, but of people who found it advantageous to have Thomas Blackwell on their side and terrifying to make him an enemy. One of these was Benjamin Franklin, whom Thomas met in 1763 at a gathering of the American Philosophical Society. Franklin was already famous. The man who'd tamed lightning, the printer who'd built an empire, the diplomat who moved between worlds. "Mr. Blackwell," Franklin said when they were introduced, "I've heard interesting things about you. They say you have a remarkable head for business." "I try to be useful, Dr. Franklin." "Usefulness is an excellent quality," Franklin replied, his eyes shrewd behind his spectacles. "Come see me at my office tomorrow. I have a proposition that might interest a useful young man." The proposition was simple. Franklin needed someone to manage certain delicate correspondence between colonial leaders and potential allies in Britain and France. Someone discreet, someone intelligent, someone with no obvious political loyalties who could be trusted with sensitive information. Thomas accepted immediately. It was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. Access to the highest levels of colonial politics, to the men who were shaping the future. Over the next several years, Thomas became indispensable to Franklin and, through him, to the broader movement toward independence. He managed secret communications, arranged clandestine meetings, moved money through channels that left no trace. He was everywhere and nowhere, trusted but never fully known. And all the while, he was building something else. The network of men from Blackwood's Journal had grown older, more established, more powerful. Edmund Carver was now a senior magistrate with political ambitions. Others held positions in the colonial government, in the church, in commerce. They thought themselves safe, that the boy who'd threatened them had moved on or died or simply lost interest. Thomas wanted them to think that, wanted them comfortable and complacent, because he wasn't done with them. Not even close. In 1765, Thomas made his first major move. He published an anonymous pamphlet titled On Justice and Cruelty, which laid out in devastating detail the network of torture and abuse that had existed in Philadelphia's highest circles. He didn't name names, not yet, but he provided enough detail that those involved would recognize themselves. And he promised more revelations to come. The pamphlet caused a sensation. It was reprinted in newspapers across the colonies. Ministers preached about it. Politicians denounced it. And somewhere in their fine houses, 12 very nervous men wondered when Thomas Blackwell would make his next move. He waited 2 years. Let them sweat. Let them make mistakes born of fear. Then, in 1767, he published a second pamphlet. This one had names, not all of them, just 3. Edmund Carver, the magistrate; Richard Thornton, a customs official; James Whitmore, a minister with a congregation of over 300. The evidence was overwhelming. Dates, amounts, testimonies from survivors Thomas had painstakingly tracked down over the years. Copies of Blackwood's journal entries, transcribed and notarized. The 3 men were arrested, tried, and convicted. Carver was stripped of his position. Thornton was imprisoned. Whitmore hanged himself before sentencing. The message was clear. Thomas Blackwell knew everything, and he would not forget. The remaining 9 men from the journal came to him one by one, offering deals, begging for mercy, trying to buy their way out. Thomas accepted their money. He was building a fortune now, but he made no promises. He simply told them to wait, to be useful, to serve causes he supported, and perhaps, if they were very lucky, he might never publish what he knew about them. By 1770, at age 26, Thomas Blackwell was one of the richest men in Philadelphia. He owned a shipping company, a printing press, shares in a dozen enterprises. He had a mansion on Society Hill, servants, fine clothes, everything that money could buy. He also had power, real power. Politicians sought his support. Merchants courted his favor. The Sons of Liberty valued his counsel and his funding. He moved in the same circles as the men who would soon lead a revolution. But none of it satisfied him, because the original sin remained unpunished. The system that had allowed him to be sold for $5 still existed. Children were still bought and sold, if not on docks, then through indentures and apprenticeships that were slavery by another name. The powerful still preyed on the weak. Thomas's revenge had been successful, but it wasn't complete. He'd destroyed individual monsters, but the larger monster, the structure of power itself, remained intact. Then came the revolution, and with it, an opportunity to burn it all down and rebuild it better. Thomas Blackwell threw himself into the revolutionary cause with the same calculating intensity he brought to everything. Not out of idealism, he'd long since abandoned such naive notions, but because revolution was the ultimate opportunity for a man of his talents. Wars created chaos, chaos created vacuums of power, and Thomas had become expert at filling such vacuums. He used his shipping company to smuggle weapons and supplies to the Continental Army. He used his printing press to publish inflammatory broadsides that pushed moderates toward rebellion. He used his network of informants to identify loyalists, who were then quietly driven from their positions and replaced with men loyal to Thomas's interests. He also used his wealth. The revolution needed money desperately, and Thomas provided it. At interest, he made loans to the Continental Congress, to individual states, to military suppliers, loans that would make him vastly richer if the revolution succeeded. In 1775, Thomas met George Washington for the first time. The general was in Philadelphia for the Continental Congress, and Thomas arranged an introduction through Benjamin Franklin. "Mr. Blackwell," Washington said, his voice carrying the weight of command, "Dr. Franklin speaks highly of you. He says you've been instrumental in supporting our cause." "I do what I can, General. I believe in what you're fighting for." Washington studied him with those piercing gray eyes. "Do you? Or do you simply believe in what victory might bring you?" Thomas smiled. He liked Washington immediately. Here was a man who understood that idealism without pragmatism was useless. Can't it be both, sir? Indeed it can, Washington replied. In fact, I prefer it that way. Men who fight for glory alone are unreliable. Men who fight for profit are predictable. And what do you fight for, General? Freedom, Washington said simply, though I suspect we define that word differently. Over the war years, Thomas and Washington developed a relationship built on mutual respect and healthy suspicion. Washington knew Thomas was profiting from the conflict, but he also knew the revolution would fail without men like him. Thomas knew Washington would never fully trust him, but he also knew the general would protect him as long as he remained useful. It was a perfect arrangement. The war itself was brutal. Thomas saw action occasionally. He served briefly as a militia captain, more for appearance than from any military ambition. He killed when necessary, but took no pleasure in it. Violence was a tool, nothing more. What he did take pleasure in was the systematic dismantling of the old order. Loyalist properties seized and auctioned. Thomas bought many of them at a fraction of their value. Royal officials fleeing for their lives. Thomas made sure certain ones didn't make it to the ships. The entire structure of colonial authority collapsing, and Thomas there to help it along. Among the loyalists was one name that made Thomas pause: Edmund Carver. The former magistrate had sided with the crown, probably hoping British protection would shield him from further exposure. Thomas arranged for information about Carver's past to reach Patriot authorities. The man was arrested as a traitor, his property confiscated, his family impoverished. Thomas attended the execution. It was the first time he'd seen Carver since that night outside the tavern 12 years earlier. The magistrate looked old now, broken. As they led him to the gallows, his eyes found Thomas in the crowd. Recognition dawned, followed by understanding. Carver tried to speak, but the noose was already around his neck. Thomas watched him hang with no more emotion than he'd feel swatting a fly. Justice, revenge, neither word quite captured what he felt. Completion, perhaps, one debt paid.